He had ridden past her homestead every single morning for a full year, always at the same unhurried pace, always with his hat pulled low and his eyes fixed somewhere on the distant horizon, as though he had somewhere tremendously important to be, and this particular stretch of Kansas road was nothing more than an inconvenience between him and that destination. Martha Dugan noticed him the very first morning. It was the spring of 1878, and the land outside Caldwell, Kansas, was still shaking off the memory of a brutal winter. The ground had only just begun to soften beneath the boots of the settlers who had staked their claims along the Chicaskia River corridor, and the air carried that particular sweetness of thawed earth and new grass that made even the most weather-hardened homesteader pause for a moment and feel something close to gratitude. Martha was pulling water from her well when she heard the soft, rhythmic clop of hooves on the dry road that ran parallel to her fence line, and she looked up without particular intention, shading her eyes against the early morning glare. He was a tall man on a dark bay horse, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain brown trail coat and a hat that had seen considerable use. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who had been on horseback since before he could properly walk, his body moving in natural harmony with the animal beneath him. He did not look at her. His gaze was settled somewhere to the northwest, toward the open grassland that rolled away from the settled plots like a green ocean frozen mid-wave. He rode past her gate at a steady walk, unhurried but purposeful, and within 30 seconds he had rounded the gentle bend in the road and disappeared behind the stand of cottonwoods at the edge of her property. Martha went back to drawing her water. She had a fence to mend, 2 acres of kitchen garden to prepare, a chicken coop that needed new straw bedding, and a list of other tasks that stretched longer than the day allowed. She was 26 years old, she had been a widow for 14 months, and she did not have the luxury of wondering about strangers on the road. But she noticed him again the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, she had established, without consciously deciding to do so, that he always passed between 6 and 6:30 in the morning, always heading northwest, always alone, always on that same dark bay horse. By the end of the second week, she had begun to be awake early enough to observe him from her kitchen window, while she drank her first cup of coffee, watching him pass through the narrow frame of wavy glass with a casual interest she told herself was purely the habit of a woman living alone on an isolated piece of land, who had sound practical reasons to keep track of who traveled her road. By the end of the first month, she admitted to herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, that she was simply curious about where he was going. The town of Caldwell in 1878 sat at the edge of civilization as most Kansans understood it. It was a cattle town, rough and raw, the last stop before Indian territory opened up to the south. The Kishom Trail ran through it like a main artery, and from April through October it pulsed with longhorn cattle and Texas drovers and all the commerce and violence and noise that such traffic inevitably produced. But the homesteads that had taken root in the surrounding countryside belonged to a different population entirely, to families and single settlers who had come to farm the rich prairie soil and build something permanent in a landscape that did not always seem interested in permanence. Martha Dugan had come to Kansas 3 years earlier with her husband Thomas, who had been a carpenter by trade and an optimist by nature. They had built the homestead together, the 2-room house of lumber and sod, the barn, the well, the fences. Thomas had died of a fever the previous winter, quietly and without warning, leaving Martha with 60 acres, a milk cow named Bess, a flock of 14 chickens, a half-finished vegetable garden, and the particular kind of grief that comes from losing not only a person you loved but the entire shared future you had mapped out together. She had stayed. This was her land, paid for and registered. Her neighbors, the Prestons to the north and old Emmett Fry to the east, had both suggested in their gentle but unmistakable ways that perhaps she might want to consider returning to her family in Missouri. She had thanked them for their concern and gone back to work. She did not have family worth returning to in Missouri, and even if she had, she was not the kind of woman who left a thing she had started. So she worked. She worked from first light to last, and she managed. She was not managing easily or comfortably, but she was managing, which was all she had promised herself she would do. By the time late summer arrived that first year of noticing the rider, Martha had accumulated a set of observations about Abel Weston, though she did not yet know his name. She knew that he rode out early and returned in the late afternoon, always from the same northwest direction. She knew his horse was healthy and well kept, which told her something about his character. She knew he rode alone consistently enough that she was fairly certain he had no regular companions on whatever errand took him out each day. She knew, from the few times she had been close enough to the road when he passed, that he was younger than his bearing suggested, probably not yet 30, with a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble and eyes that she had glimpsed once, just once, when his horse had shied briefly at a rabbit crossing the road, and he had glanced around in the automatic way a rider does when an animal startles. His eyes were a particular shade of gray, the kind that caught light like river water in shallow places. She thought about that for an embarrassingly long time. The first conversation they ever had was not planned by either of them and was precipitated entirely by her fence. It was a Tuesday in mid-September of 1878, still deep in what felt like summer despite the calendar's insistence on the contrary. Martha had been struggling since dawn with a section of her north fence that the summer storms had weakened, and by mid-morning she had worked herself into a state of determined frustration. The wire was fighting her. The post was leaning at an angle that made her physical situation considerably more difficult, and she had just succeeded in slicing her left palm open on a piece of barbed wire when she heard the sound of a horse stopping on the road behind her. She turned, pressing her bleeding hand against the front of her work apron, and found the rider on the dark bay horse sitting perhaps 10 feet away on the other side of her fence line, watching her with an expression of quiet concern. He was not passing this morning. He had stopped. "That wire cut you," he said. It was a plain observation, not a question, delivered in a voice that was low and steady, the kind of voice that had been shaped by years of having nothing nearby to talk to except horses and open sky. "I noticed," she said, because that was the honest answer, and she did not have the patience for polite pretending when her hand was bleeding and her fence was still broken. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but the possibility of one. "I could help with that post," he said, "if you want." She looked at him. He sat very still on his horse, not pushing, not performing helpfulness, just offering it in the same plain way he had stated the fact of her injury. His hat was pulled a little to the side against the morning glare, and she could see his face properly for the first time since that one distant glimpse months ago. He was younger than she had estimated from a distance, perhaps 28 or 29. His hands on the reins were large and were roughened, the hands of a man who used them constantly. "I would be obliged," she said after a moment, because the fence was not going to fix itself and she was not too proud to accept help with a legitimate physical problem. He dismounted in that unhurried, economical way that experienced horsemen have, looped his reins around the fence post nearest the road, and came through the gate she indicated. He looked at her hand first, not the fence. "You should wrap that," he said. "I will, after the fence." He looked at her for a moment, then at the fence, then apparently decided she was the kind of person whose priorities were fixed in the order she had stated them. He took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. She worked alongside him, her cut hand wrapped now in a strip she had torn from her apron pocket cloth, and they managed the post and the wire section together in about 40 minutes. When it was done, he picked up his coat and looked at the repaired section with professional assessment. "That will hold," he said, "but the post 2 down is going to go before winter." "I know," she said. He nodded as if this confirmed something. Then he looked at her directly, and she realized this was the first time he had done so without something else to focus on, and the directness of it was a little startling. "Abel Weston," he said. "I have a quarter section about 3 miles northwest of here." "Martha Dugan," she said. "I have 60 acres here, and the fence is apparently trying to undo all my good work." That possibility of a smile appeared again, this time resolving into an actual one, brief and genuine, before it retreated. He put his hat back on properly. "I pass this road every morning," he said, which was such a plain acknowledgment of a thing they both already knew that it almost made her laugh. "I had noticed," she said. He looked at her again, that gray-water gaze, steady and measuring, and something else she could not immediately name. Then he nodded once, retrieved his horse, and rode on. She watched him go, pressing her wrapped hand against her hip, and then she turned back to her work. She thought about the smile for a week. In the months that followed, the pattern of their acquaintance established itself with the organic carefulness of two people who were each managing something fragile and did not want to be careless with it. He began stopping occasionally, not every day, but often enough to develop a rhythm. Sometimes it was a practical exchange, a question about her well mechanism, which he had more experience with than she did, or an observation about the approaching weather that was useful to a farmer. Sometimes it was briefer than that, just a touch of his hat brim, and a word or two passed over the fence before he rode on. She began to learn things about him in the accumulated way of these small encounters. He had come to Kansas from Missouri too, as it happened, from a farm outside Springfield, and had homesteaded his quarter section 2 years before she and Thomas had arrived. He ran a small cattle operation, nothing like the grand Texas drives that thundered through Caldwell each spring and summer, but a careful, managed herd of some 30 head that he raised on his own grass and sold when the prices and timing suited him. He was quiet but not shy, reserved but not cold, and he listened when she spoke with an attentiveness that she found both flattering and slightly unnerving. She also began to understand, in the careful way she had of understanding things she was not ready to act on, that his morning rides past her homestead were not entirely incidental. There were other roads that ran northwest from Caldwell. She knew this because she had occasion to travel them herself for various errands. His route past her fence line was not the most direct way to anywhere in particular. It added perhaps a half-mile to any journey he might plausibly be making. She turned this fact over in her mind occasionally, examining it, setting it back down without coming to any conclusions that she was prepared to act on. Her neighbor, Mrs. Preston, a forthright woman in her 40s whose husband ran the most successful dairy operation in the county, had her own conclusions, which she shared with Martha over tea one November afternoon. "That Weston man stops at your place pretty regular," Mrs. Preston said, in the tone of someone making an observation that is intended to prompt a response. "He is a neighborly sort," Martha said, which was not precisely true, as Abel Weston was notably not the kind of man who scattered his sociability broadly. He stopped at her place as far as she could tell. He did not stop at the Prestons, or at Emmett Fry's, or at any of the other homesteads that the morning road past. Mrs. Preston gave her the look of a woman who understood the difference between a true statement and a complete one. "He is not married," she said. "A great many people in Kansas are not married," Martha said, "including me." "Precisely," said Mrs. Preston, with the air of someone who has made her point and is satisfied to leave it there. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a hard one. The blizzards that came down from the north in January and February were the kind that settled over the land like a closing fist, and for 3 weeks Martha was essentially confined to her homestead, keeping her livestock alive and herself fed and warm with the grim efficiency that survival required. When the roads cleared enough to permit travel, Abel appeared at her gate one Thursday morning, not just stopping but dismounting and coming through without waiting for an invitation, which was unusual enough that she came out of the house to meet him. "I have not seen smoke from your chimney in 2 days," he said, and his voice carried something in it that she had not heard before, a tightness that she recognized after a moment as the controlled residue of worry. "I was conserving fuel," she said. "I have been fine." He looked at her for a moment with that steady gray gaze, and then he looked at her house, her barn, her fence line, with the systematic assessment of a man doing a damage inventory. "Your barn door is broken," he said. "The wind got it 2 nights ago. I will fix it." "You do not have to. I will fix it," he said again, not stubbornly but with a quietness that was, she was learning, his version of emphasis. He fixed the barn door and the loose section of siding that had been worrying her since October, and then he carried in more firewood than she had requested and stacked it with the methodical care of a man who was measuring future necessity against present supply. When he was leaving, she said from the doorway, "Thank you, Abel." He paused, one hand on his horse's neck, and looked back at her. The winter light was flat and pale, and the cold had put color in his face, and he looked, in that particular moment, like something out of a painting of the frontier that had managed to capture something true about what life here actually was. He looked at her for just a breath longer than the situation required. "I will come by again in a few days," he said, "to make sure you have enough wood." He did, and then again after that, and the rhythm of their acquaintance deepened through the cold months, acquiring warmth of its own against the backdrop of the bitter Kansas winter. By the time the spring of 1879 came, they had been on talking terms for the better part of a year, and the talking had taken on a quality that Martha recognized as something different from neighborly exchange. They talked about their work, yes, and about the weather and the crops and the particular challenges of sustaining a small operation in a landscape that seemed indifferent to human effort. But they also talked about other things, about Missouri, and the different ways they had each left it, and what they had each been looking for when they arrived in Kansas. About books, which she had in modest supply and which he read with an appetite that surprised her given his solitary life. About the town of Caldwell itself, which was in the process of its transformation from a barely organized cattle town into something attempting at least the appearance of civilization, with a proper school building now and a second church, and a ladies' aid society that met on Tuesday afternoons. They talked about Thomas once in the early spring, when she was planting, and he had stopped to rest his horse, and found himself drawn into conversation that went longer than either of them had planned. She told him about Thomas simply and honestly, about the man Thomas had been and what his loss had cost her, and Abel listened the way he always listened, with full attention and without trying to manage what she was feeling or redirect her toward feeling something more convenient. When she was done, he said, "He sounds like he was a good man," and she said, "He was," and there was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. "How did you come to be alone out here?" She asked because it seemed fair to ask since she had told him something real. He was quiet for a moment, watching the new grass move in the light wind. "I came out here specifically to be alone," he said. "I had some things I needed to think through without other people's opinions getting in the way of the thinking." "And have you thought them through?" He looked at her then, and something in the quality of his look made her pulse behave in a way she had not authorized. "I am getting there," he said. Spring deepened into summer, and the Kishom Trail came alive again with the cattle drives that were the heartbeat of Caldwell's economy. The town filled up with drovers from Texas, and the saloons roared until all hours, and the occasional gunshot punctuated the night air over the settlement. It was not a peaceful place in those months, but it was a vital one, full of money and movement and the particular energy of commerce being conducted at full pitch. Martha went to town once a week for supplies and whatever news was circulating, and it was on one of these trips in late June of 1879 that she first encountered Dale Cutter. Cutter was a land speculator, one of a type that had been multiplying in Kansas as the homesteading population grew, and the value of properly placed land became increasingly apparent. He was smooth in the way of men who had discovered early that smoothness was commercially useful, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a manner that simulated warmth without actually producing any. He had been buying up land claims from homesteaders who had given up or needed cash, sometimes fairly, sometimes through methods that did not bear close examination. He spoke to Martha at the general store, where she was collecting her flour and coffee, with a practiced friendliness that she recognized instantly as professional in nature. He had heard, he said, that she was managing the Dugan homestead alone since her husband's passing, and he wanted her to know, as a gesture of neighborly concern, that if she ever found the situation difficult, he would be happy to discuss options. Options, she repeated. The land market is quite favorable right now, he said. You might be surprised what your 60 acres could bring. I am not interested in selling, she said, pleasantly but with a clarity that left no ambiguity. He nodded and smiled and moved on, and she finished her shopping and rode home and thought about the encounter with the practical, unsentimental part of her mind that she had developed as a matter of survival. Cutter was not the first person to suggest she might want to sell. He would not be the last. She was not going to sell. She mentioned it to Abel the next morning, partly as information sharing between neighbors and partly because she found that she wanted to tell him things, that the desire to bring him the particulars of her day had become so natural that she barely noticed it anymore. His expression changed in a way she had not seen before when she described Cutter and his offer. Something tightened in his jaw. He has been working his way through the smaller homesteads south of town, he said. Emmett Fry almost sold to him last autumn. What stopped him? I told Emmett what I knew about Cutter's business practices, Abel said, which is that he is not above applying pressure when his initial approach does not work. Martha absorbed this. He will apply pressure to me, she said. It was not a question. Probably, Abel said. You are a woman alone on 60 acres of good land. He will assume that gives him advantages. He is wrong about the advantages, she said. Abel looked at her, and that quality she could never quite name was back in his expression, that mixture of appraisal and something warmer that she had been steadfastly not analyzing for months now. I know you are, he said quietly. But it might be useful to know you have people who will stand with you if the pressure he applies is more than words. Are you offering to be one of those people? I am telling you that I already am one of those people, he said. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched several seconds past conversational necessity. Thank you, Abel, she said, for the second time since she had known him, and it meant something different this time than it had in January. Cutter's campaign, as it turned out, did not take long to escalate. Through July, he sent intermediaries twice, men who rode to her fence with polite reiterations of his interest in purchasing her land, each time with a slightly higher number attached to the offer. She declined each time with consistent courtesy and firmness. In August, she found that her northern water rights had been challenged through the county land office, a legal maneuver that her neighbor Emmett Fry, who had some experience with such things, identified as almost certainly Cutter's work. It was genuinely alarming. Without the northern water access, her ability to sustain her kitchen garden through dry summers, which were common in Kansas, would be severely compromised. She went to the county land office herself and spent 2 days working through the documentation, establishing from the original homestead claim that her water rights were properly recorded and predated any competing interest. The clerk, a Mr. Hendricks who was meticulous and fair-minded despite working in a system that was frequently neither, confirmed that her documentation was sound and dismissed the challenge. She rode home feeling the specific exhausted triumph of having won a fight she should not have had to have. Abel was at her gate when she arrived, which was unusual at that hour, mid-afternoon, outside his normal pattern. Hendricks told me you had been in, he said. I came to find out how it went. I won, she said. He let out a slow breath that told her more about how worried he had been than he would probably have chosen to tell her directly. Good, he said. That is very good. Cutter is not going to stop, she said, because she knew it to be true. No, Abel agreed. But you have the documentation. If he tries the legal route again, he will lose again. He paused. He may try something less legal. She thought about this. What can he actually do? Interfere with your fences. Interfere with your livestock. Make things difficult enough that you want to leave. He said this plainly, not trying to frighten her but not softening it either, because he had learned over a year of knowing her that she did not want things softened. Let him try, she said. He almost smiled. That is what I thought you would say. What Cutter tried, as it happened, was neither fences nor livestock but something more direct. On a warm August evening, two men she did not know came to her door after sunset and told her, with the careful language of people who have been instructed to stay just shy of explicit threat, that the man they worked for was making her one final offer for her land, and that it would be in her best interest to consider it seriously. She told them to get off her property. They left without incident, but the feeling of vulnerability that settled over her after they had gone was real and unwelcome. She was one woman on 60 isolated acres, and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away. The door she bolted that night felt suddenly less substantial than it had before. She did not tell Abel about it immediately. She spent a day working through it herself, thinking about what her options actually were, what the sheriff could and could not do, what the practical realities of her situation required. She was not the kind of person who ran to others with her problems, and she was also not the kind of person who let pride prevent her from using available resources wisely. The following morning, when Abel came by on his regular route, she was waiting at the gate rather than at the house. He saw her expression as he drew up and stopped before she said a word. "What happened?" he asked. She told him. His face went still in the way she had come to associate with him, managing a strong feeling very carefully. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You need to tell Sheriff Hartley," he said. "I know. I am going to town today. I will come with you." She hesitated, and he saw the hesitation. "Not because you need me to," he said, with a precise understanding of what she had been about to say. "Because Hartley will take it more seriously if I am there to corroborate what I know about Cutter's methods. I have already spoken to him once about Cutter. 2 accounts are stronger than 1. She looked at him. He was right, and the rightness was practical, not a matter of her needing a man to speak for her, and she believed that he knew the difference and was offering the practical thing and not the other thing. "All right," she said. "I would appreciate that." Sheriff Hartley was a methodical man who had been doing this job long enough to know that Caldwell's transition from cattle drive chaos to stable town was not going to be smooth, and that land speculation was one of the significant rough patches in that transition. He listened to Martha's account with careful attention, asked several precise questions, and wrote everything down. He had his own file on Cutter's activities in the county, which was more substantial than Martha had known. "I cannot arrest a man for making an offer," Hartley said, "but I can make it known that his activities are under observation, and I can arrange for a deputy to ride your road more regularly, Mrs. Dugan." "I would appreciate that," she said again. Hartley did as he promised. The increased sheriff's presence on her road seemed to be sufficient discouragement. Cutter's men did not come back. By October, she heard through the usual channels of frontier communication that Cutter had shifted his attentions to a less contested area further north, where smaller and more isolated homesteads offered easier targets. She felt a complicated mixture of relief for herself and something like guilt for whoever those people in the north were, before concluding practically that she could not fight every battle and had done what she could in her own. The resolution of the Cutter situation left her with an interesting emotional residue. Throughout the weeks of that trouble, Abel had been present in a way that was different from before, more frequent in his visits, more direct in his expressions of concern, more obviously engaged in her welfare. She had found his presence steadying and valuable in a way that she could not entirely attribute to pure friendship. She was sitting with this one October evening, watching the last light fade over her 60 acres, the kitchen garden put to bed for the season, and the first breath of coming winter in the air, when she identified what she had been feeling with a clarity she could not subsequently argue with. She was in love with Abel Weston. She sat with this for several minutes, examining it from various angles the way she examined all significant facts, and it did not change its character under examination. It was there, fully formed, as though it had been growing quietly for a long time in a part of her that she had not been supervising, and had only now pushed far enough into her attention to make itself impossible to overlook. She was not frightened by it. She had been 22 when she married Thomas, and that had been a real and good love, and she did not feel that loving Abel in any way diminished what she had had with Thomas. She was 27 now, and the year since his death and the 2 years before that of building something real in the Kansas soil had made her someone who had less patience for pretending she felt something other than what she felt. What she was uncertain. She did not know what Abel felt. She had her evidence, the morning rides on the roundabout road, the reliability of his presence, the particular quality of his attention. But evidence could be interpreted multiple ways, and she had no interest in making herself ridiculous by acting on a conclusion she had not properly verified. She decided to simply be more honest, to let what she felt be a little less concealed, and to see what that produced. The following morning, when he stopped at her gate, she was at the fence rather than at the house, and when he drew up she looked at him with less of her usual careful composure and more of the direct warmth that she usually kept to herself. "Good morning, Abel," she said, and she let it mean a little more than it usually did. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted in a way that she found very interesting. "Good morning, Martha," he said, and his voice had a different quality, something lower and more deliberate. They talked for an hour, which was longer than usual, about nothing in particular, about the coming winter, and whether the signs suggested it would be worse than the previous one, about a book she had finished and was willing to lend him, about the news from town that the school was hiring a proper teacher from back east. The conversation was on its surface entirely ordinary, but underneath it something had changed, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly, but the knowing was there between them like a third presence. He began stopping for longer stretches. Some mornings he would come in and take coffee at her kitchen table, and they would sit across from each other with the morning light coming through the window and talk in a way that felt so natural and complete that she sometimes lost track of the fact that less than 2 years ago she had not known he existed. She learned more about him in those kitchen table mornings than she had in all the fence-line conversations combined. She learned that he had a younger sister in Missouri whom he wrote to regularly. She learned that he had come to Kansas after a broken engagement that he mentioned only briefly and without bitterness, noting simply that they had both been too young, and it had been for the best. She learned that he read more widely than any man she had encountered since leaving Missouri, that he had opinions about history and politics and the management of the frontier that were thoughtful and sometimes surprising. She learned that he had a capacity for laughter that he kept mostly private, that his humor was dry and precise, and appeared infrequently enough to be genuinely delightful when it surfaced. She told him things, too, about her childhood in Missouri with parents who had worked hard and loved imperfectly, about the education she had managed to give herself in the absence of much formal schooling, about what she had discovered about her own character in the 14 months since Thomas died, which was that she was tougher than she had previously known and more independent than she had been permitted to be while married, not because Thomas had been a bad husband, but because the nature of that life had not required her particular variety of toughness in the way that this solitary homestead life did. "Do you miss being married?" Abel asked her one morning in November, and the directness of the question startled her enough that she answered honestly without thinking about it. I miss Thomas, she said. I miss the partnership of having someone who was building the same thing you were building. I miss the company in the evenings. She paused. I do not miss the compromises you make when you are young and do not yet know yourself well enough to know which compromises matter. He was quiet, looking at his coffee cup. And now, he said. Do you know yourself well enough now? She looked at him directly. I think so, she said. I know what I want. I know what I value. I know what kind of person I want to spend my life with if I am lucky enough to have that again. He raised his eyes to hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence was so full of specific meaning that it seemed almost unnecessary to say anything at all. Martha, he said, and his voice had that quality again, the low, careful, deliberate quality that she associated with him managing something that mattered considerably. Abel, she said. He stopped, and she watched him find the words with the same methodical care he brought to everything. I have been trying to find the right time to say this for longer than I want to admit, he said. And I have been telling myself that I would say it when the moment was right, and I have been riding past your gate every morning for a year now and coming in for coffee and fixing your fence, and I think what I have actually been doing is being afraid. She stared at him. You, she said, afraid, particularly of this, he said, particularly of saying something that matters and having it change what we have, if what I say is not, he stopped again. If you do not feel. Abel, she said, and she put her hand over his on the table and he went completely still, looking at her hand on his, and she felt the warmth of his hand under hers and the faint tremor in it that told her what she needed to know. You are not going to say anything that changes what we have for the worse, she said. Whatever you say, we will still be us, so please say it. He turned his hand under hers so that his fingers wrapped around hers, and he looked up at her with an expression so unguarded that it made her chest ache with tenderness. I love you, he said. I have loved you for a very long time. I want to court you properly, if you will let me, and I want to ask you to marry me, if you would ever consider it, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret staying on this piece of land. The December light was coming through the kitchen window and falling across the table between them, and Martha Dugan, who had worked 60 acres alone for 14 months and won a fight with a land speculator and learned things about her own character that surprised her, found that her eyes were stinging in a way that she had not anticipated and did not bother to be embarrassed about. I love you, she said. I have been trying very hard not to, for months, because I did not know if you felt the same and I was afraid of being foolish. You, he said, afraid of being foolish. Particularly of this, she said, echoing his words, and that produced the real laugh, the private one she so rarely heard, and it was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. He courted her with the same deliberate, unhurried earnestness that characterized everything he did. He came to her homestead not just in the mornings, but in the evenings too, and they sat on the small porch she had built onto the house's south side in the last summer and talked until the stars came out. And he was a man who knew the stars, their names and their patterns, and the stories that various traditions had attached to them. And she sat beside him in the cold November air with a wool blanket across her lap and her shoulder close to his, and listened to him talk about things that had nothing to do with livestock prices or fence repair. And she thought that this was what she had wanted without knowing how to name it. He kissed her for the first time on a December evening, after they had been sitting on the porch long enough that they had moved into the kitchen for warmth, and been standing near the stove talking about whether to try expanding her chicken operation in the spring. And he had turned from the window where he had been looking at the stars, and looked at her with that open expression she had only seen since the morning she had put her hand over his. And she had taken one step toward him because she was not a person who waited for things to come to her when she knew what she wanted, and he had met her halfway in the very literal sense, and the kiss was gentle and deliberate and warm, and when it ended he rested his forehead against hers and they stood there in the kitchen light for a moment that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. I would like to marry you, he said against her hair. You already asked, she said. I am asking again properly. Will you marry me, Martha Dugan? Yes, she said. Obviously yes. He pulled back enough to look at her, and the expression on his face was the unguarded one, the one she had first seen in November and that she had decided was her favorite thing she had ever seen in her life. Obviously, he repeated. You have been riding past my gate every morning for a year, she said. It was not very well disguised. I thought it was quite subtle, he said. You added half a mile to your morning ride for a year, she said. That is not subtle, Abel. That is not even in the same county as subtle. He laughed again, and she put her hand against his jaw, and he turned his face slightly into her palm in a gesture so natural and unself-conscious that it made her eyes sting again. And she thought that this was the truest version of a thing she had ever seen. This careful man who had added half a mile to his morning for an entire year, because he could not quite bring himself to stop and say what he felt. They were married in Caldwell in the spring of 1880, on a bright April Saturday that smelled of new grass and possibility. The wedding was performed by the minister of the Methodist Church, which was the church Martha attended when winter roads permitted, and witnessed by the Prestons and Emmett Fry and Abel's younger sister Clara, who had come from Missouri for the occasion, and who turned out to be a lively, direct-spoken woman of 22 with her brother's gray eyes and considerably more willingness to express what she was thinking at any given moment. Clara embraced Martha at the church door with the warmth of genuine feeling and said, "He wrote me about you for months before he finally did anything about it. He used approximately 8 letters describing your fence repair skills and your kitchen garden layout before he mentioned, in passing, that he thought you might be the finest person he had ever encountered." 8 letters about my fence, Martha said. And 2 about the garden, Clara said. He thought he was being discreet. He was not, Martha said, and Clara laughed and linked her arm through Martha's and said, I think you are exactly what he needed, with the simple conviction of someone who had watched her brother be lonely for a long time and was deeply relieved to see it ending. The wedding dinner was held at the Preston house, which was larger than either of theirs and hosted the occasion with generous efficiency. There was food in abundance, and the kind of community warmth that the frontier produced when people who had survived hard things together chose to celebrate the good ones. Abel danced with Martha at the small party that followed the dinner, waltzing in the cleared space of the Preston parlor to the fiddle music that Mr. Preston produced with surprising competence. And she thought as she turned under his hand that she could not have imagined, 14 months ago when she was pulling water from her well and watching a stranger ride past on a dark bay horse, that it would come to this. To this particular moment of warmth and music, and the feeling of his hands, and the expression on his face that she had learned to read. They went home to her homestead that evening, which was to be their homestead now, 60 acres plus Abel's quarter section, connected by the road he had been riding for a year on increasingly less defensible pretexts. The practical question of which house to live in and what to do with the other had been resolved in advance. They would live in Martha's, which was better situated on the land and had the benefit of the work she and Thomas had put into it, and they would use Abel's house for storage and eventually, when the time came, for other purposes. That night, their first night as husband and wife, they sat on the south porch that she had built, wrapped in the same wool blanket that they had shared on many December evenings, and looked out over 60 acres of Kansas land that was just beginning to show its spring colors, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the steady warmth of him beside her and the particular quality of rightness that she had not expected to feel again. I am glad you kept riding past, she said. I am glad you noticed, he said. I noticed the first morning, she said. He was quiet for a moment. So did I, he said. Notice, the first morning I rode past. She lifted her head to look at him. You saw me the very first morning. You were pulling water from the well, he said. The morning light was behind you. You had your hair pinned up and your sleeves rolled down because it was still cold, and you looked up at me and went back to your water without any particular interest, and I rode past and thought he stopped. Thought what? She asked. That I would probably find a reason to ride past again, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. A year, she said. A whole year. I told you I was afraid, he said. You are also a very stubborn man, she said. Yes, he agreed, completely without apology. But I got there eventually. She put her head back on his shoulder and looked out at the darkening land, and he put his arm around her. And they sat there together in the particular piece of people who have found their way to something they had been moving toward for a long time. The summer of 1880 was a good one. The combined operation of their two homesteads, managed together with the efficiency that comes from two capable people working toward the same goal, produced results that neither had managed alone. Martha's kitchen garden expanded to a full acre, supplying not only their own needs but a modest surplus that she sold at the Caldwell market on Saturdays. Abel's cattle herd, given the benefit of the additional grazing land from her acreage, grew to 50 head by autumn, and the sale that October put them in a financial position significantly more secure than either had occupied alone. They worked well together, which she had suspected but was glad to confirm. He respected her judgment and her capabilities without having to be taught to do so, which she had thought would be the case but had been pleasantly surprised to find was even more consistently true than she had anticipated. She made decisions about the homestead without deferring to him unnecessarily, and he valued rather than resisted this, and they had disagreements occasionally about practical matters that were resolved by one of them making a better argument and the other conceding it without accumulated grievance, which was the only way Martha had ever wanted to manage disagreements. They rode out together on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, not northwest on the route he had taken alone for all those months, but south and east, out into the open grassland where the land rolled in those long, gradual swells that made the sky feel like something you could nearly reach. She had come to love Kansas in a way she had not expected, the scale of it, the wildness just beneath the surface of the domesticated parts, the way the light moved over the grass in the late afternoon as though the land itself were breathing. Riding out with Abel beside her on those Sunday mornings, talking about whatever came to mind or saying nothing at all as the situation required, was something she had come to value with a depth that surprised her. By the autumn of 1880, she had started to suspect what she confirmed in October, that they were expecting a child. She told Abel on a Tuesday evening, at the kitchen table, with the directness she applied to all significant information. He sat very still for a moment, and she watched the news travel through him, watched it reach his expression, and what it produced there was so nakedly joyful that she had to look away for a moment to compose herself, because the sight of Abel Weston's joy when it was completely unguarded was almost more than she could manage without embarrassing herself. "Martha," he said, and his voice had the same quality it had when he had first told her he loved her, that low, deliberate, precisely careful quality. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Are you well? Is everything?" "I am fine," she said. "I feel perfectly well. I know what to expect because Mrs. Preston gave me a comprehensive lecture on the subject 3 days ago, apparently having arrived at her own conclusions before I announced mine." He laughed, the good one, the private one, and squeezed her hands, and his eyes were bright in a way she did not see often and loved unreasonably. The pregnancy proceeded well through the winter, and Clara came back from Missouri in February, ostensibly for a visit and transparently to be present for the birth, which she managed with the bossiness of a loving younger sister who had opinions about the proper management of everything and was not shy about expressing them. The baby came in late March of 1881, on a morning when the Kansas sky was the particular clean blue that appeared after a cold front had passed, and the world felt rinsed and new. They named him Thomas, for the man whose work was part of the foundation they were building on, and for Abel's father, whose name had also been Thomas, which seemed to Martha like the kind of coincidence that meant something. Thomas Weston was a healthy, serious-faced, brown-eyed infant who regarded the world with the same methodical attentiveness that his father brought to everything, and who, from the first weeks, showed a clear preference for being carried rather than laid down, which kept both his parents moving more or less continuously through the early months, but which neither of them minded as much as they would have expected. Clara stayed until May and was genuinely useful and only occasionally insufferable, and when she left she embraced Martha at the road and said, with the simple directness she always had, "You are exactly what this family needed, both of you." And Martha, who was holding Thomas in one arm and was slightly sleep-deprived, and was filled with a love for this particular set of people that she had not planned for and could not imagine being without, said, "So are you," and meant it. Life settled into the rhythm of the combined homestead through the years that followed, and it was a full rhythm, demanding and seasonal and sometimes exhausting and consistently rewarding in the way that lives spent building real things are rewarding. Abel expanded the cattle operation gradually and wisely, never overextending, always managing the herd size against the carrying capacity of the land. Martha diversified the garden operation into a modest but reliable market enterprise, and in 1882 she began keeping bees, which produced honey that sold reliably at the Caldwell market, and that she also used in a preserving operation that, by 1883, supplied several of the town's households. Caldwell itself was changing around them. The cattle drives from Texas began declining in the early 1880s as the railheads moved further south and west, and with the trail drive money went some of the town's rawer energies, its violence and its transience, and the particular quality of a place that was always full of people passing through. What was left was more settled, more permanent, a town that was becoming what the homesteaders around it had been building toward all along, a real community, with a proper school that their son would eventually attend, 2 churches, a doctor's office, a bank, and the complex web of relationships and obligations and histories that make a place into a home. They were part of it, Martha and Abel Weston, in the way that people who have been in a place from its difficult early days are always part of the story of what it becomes. Abel served on the County Land Assessment Board for several years, a position that allowed him to do something concrete about the kind of land speculation, abuses that Cutter had attempted, making the assessment process more transparent and the documentation more rigorous. Martha became active in the Ladies' Aid Society, not the genteel charitable operation she had initially assumed it was, but a genuinely practical organization that provided material support to new homesteaders in their first difficult years, particularly women who found themselves alone on their land for any of the several reasons the frontier provided for such circumstances. She thought about herself at 26, drawing water from her well and watching a stranger ride past, and she tried to be for those women what she would have wanted someone to be for her, present and practical and respectful of their capacity to manage their own situations while offering real help when real help was needed. In the spring of 1883, they had their second child, a girl they named Alice, after Martha's mother, who had died when Martha was 12, and whom she had thought about more since becoming a mother herself than she had in the intervening years. Alice was from the beginning her own distinct person, louder and more immediate than her serious older brother, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's particular quality of absolute determination, and she made herself known in any room she occupied in a way that delighted Martha and occasionally exhausted Abel, who was better equipped for this kind of energy than he would previously have believed. With 2 children and a productive homestead and a genuine community around them, their life in those years had the particular richness that comes from having built something real over time, from having worked through the difficult parts honestly, and emerged into the good parts knowing what they cost and valuing them accordingly. They still rode out on Sunday mornings when the season and the children's schedules permitted. The four of them now. Thomas old enough by 1885 to manage his own pony, Alice in the saddle with one parent or the other, moving through the Kansas grassland in the particular light of a Sunday morning when the whole week stretched ahead unhurried. Martha would look at Abel riding beside her, the man who had added half a mile to his morning for a year because he was afraid to stop, and she would feel something so deep and so settled that she did not have adequate language for it, only the knowledge that it was real and that it was hers, and that it was the thing she would have wanted if she had known to want it. He still rode northwest in the mornings, some mornings, when there was work on that part of the land that required it. He still had the dark bay horse, older now, gray at the muzzle, replaced in heavy work duties by a younger animal but still ridden by Abel regularly as a point of personal loyalty that she found endearing. Sometimes she would watch him from the kitchen window as she had done 100 times before she knew his name, and she would think about that year of him riding past and both of them being afraid of the same thing, and she would think about all the mornings that had accumulated since then, all the ordinary and extraordinary things that had happened in this place they had made together. One autumn evening in 1885, she and Abel were sitting on the south porch in the last of the day's light, Thomas inside doing his school lessons and Alice improbably asleep since it was still light enough outside to play, and the land in front of them was golden in the way Kansas land got in October, that particular warm gold that looked like the light was coming from the ground rather than from the sky. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, because he had been quiet for a long time with that inward expression that meant he was turning something over. "I was thinking about the first morning I rode past," he said. She looked at him. He was looking out at the land, the lines of his face familiar now in the way of beloved things, known so well that they were part of the furniture of her mind. "What about it?" she said. "I was thinking that I must have known," he said. "That first morning, some part of me must have known what was going to happen because a man does not add half a mile to his morning and maintain that for a year on a casual basis." "What do you think you knew?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That this was it," he said. "That you were the one. That the half mile was entirely worth it and would go on being worth it indefinitely." He turned to look at her, and the gray-water eyes were the same as they had always been, the eyes she had noticed from 30 feet away in the September of 1878 when his horse had shied at a rabbit. "I was just afraid to believe it," he said, "because believing it meant risking it. And now," she said. He put his hand over hers on the armrest between their chairs, the same gesture she had made at the kitchen table in November of 1879, the one that had started everything. "Now I am grateful every single morning," he said, "that I eventually stopped." She turned her hand under his so their fingers were interlaced, looking at his hand over hers, his larger and more weathered than the morning she had first covered it, and felt it tremble. She thought about 60 acres and a broken fence, and a year of watching a man ride past and not knowing what to do with what she felt. She thought about Thomas, who had built the foundation, and about the children who were its continuation, and about the community they were woven into, and about the land under the October sky that she had chosen to stay on when everything in her situation argued that she might want to go. She was 29 when they married. She was 33 now. She had been a widow and a farmer and a market gardener and a beekeeper and a member of every organization in Caldwell that seemed worth joining and a mother and a wife and herself, continuously and without apology through all of it. "I am glad you stopped," she said. "I would have said something eventually if you had not." He looked at her surprised. "You would have." "I told you," she said. "I know what I want. I was getting impatient." He laughed, the good laugh, the private one that still appeared less frequently than the other sounds he made, but that she had accumulated years of now, and that still felt like something given specifically to her. "You never said anything," he said. "I put my hand over yours at the kitchen table," she said. "That was not nothing." "That is true," he said, and his thumb moved across her knuckles in a slow stroke, and they sat together in the October light on the porch she had built, watching the Kansas land do the golden thing it did in late afternoon, and the comfortable silence between them was full of all the things they had said over the years, and all the things they did not need to say. Inside the house, Thomas finished his lessons and started arguing with the lamp about the quality of its light, and Alice woke up from her uncharacteristic nap and began making her presence known in the decisive way she had, and the ordinary evening of their life reassembled itself around them with the reliable, imperfect, entirely beloved quality of ordinary evenings that have been accumulated in a real place with real people. Martha stood from her chair and went to see about supper, and Abel followed her into the kitchen where they had first drunk coffee together and had their first honest conversation, and where he had first told her he loved her in that careful, long-accumulated way of his. And the kitchen was warm from the stove she had kept going all day, and the children's voices came through from the other room, and the October dark was beginning to come down outside the window. She was at the stove when he came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind, his chin at the top of her head, looking out the window with her at the last of the evening light on the Kansas land. "Thank you," he said very quietly, "for staying." She leaned back into him, feeling the warmth and the steadiness of him, the man who had ridden half a mile out of his way every morning for a year because he could not stop and could not quite bring himself to start. "Thank you," she said, "for finally stopping." Outside, the October stars were beginning to appear over the prairie, one at a time, the way they always did, patient and certain, in no particular hurry to arrive but arriving nonetheless, the way all good things eventually do if you are paying attention and willing to stay. The years ahead of them were full. The following spring brought a wet season that made Martha's garden the most productive it had ever been, and the honey harvest that summer was large enough to supply half the households in Caldwell, and still leave enough for their own use through the winter. Abel's cattle operation reached 80 head, and he began selling not just to the local market, but to buyers out of Wichita, which put them on a more comfortable financial footing than either had imagined during the lean early years. Thomas turned 5 and started at the Caldwell School and came home each day with the serious, measured observations of a child who was paying close attention to the world and categorizing what he found there. Alice turned 3 and was already managing her pony without assistance, a fact that delighted Abel and worried Martha in equal measure. Clara came to visit every summer for a week, and eventually moved to Kansas herself in 1886, marrying a farmer named Robert Hale who had a good piece of land 20 miles east of Caldwell, and the family expanded in that direction too, with visits going back and forth along the eastern road, and Clara's children growing up knowing the Weston homestead as a second home. Emmett Fry, their neighbor to the east who had nearly sold to Cutter, lived to 78 and died quietly in his bed in the autumn of 1887, and in his will he left a small piece of his northernmost acreage to Martha and Abel with a note that said simply that they had been good neighbors to him, and he wanted his land to be with good neighbors. They received this with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that they were the keepers now of something an older man had worked his whole life to make, and they managed that additional acreage with the same care they gave to everything. The Prestons moved to Wichita in 1884, as Caldwell's Cattletown era wound down and the commercial opportunities of a larger city beckoned. Martha missed Mrs. Preston's forthright conversation and the generous hospitality of her household, and they maintained a correspondence that lasted for decades, letters traveling back and forth between Caldwell and Wichita with the reliability of good friendships maintained by people who know their value. In 1888, on a September morning remarkably similar to the September morning 10 years earlier, when Martha had been pulling water from her well, she was at the fence line again, this time supervising Thomas, now 7, who was learning to manage the wire with his father's careful guidance. Abel was demonstrating the proper technique for tensioning a fence line, talking Thomas through it in that steady, patient voice he used for explaining practical things. And Alice, at 5, was sitting on the top rail of the gate watching with the critical attention of a person who intended to be doing this herself within the week. A rider came down the road, a young man Martha did not recognize, perhaps 20 or 21, on a tired horse that had been ridden some distance. He stopped at their fence in the way of travelers who needed something, water or directions or a moment to rest his horse. Abel looked up. Martha moved to the gate. The young man took his hat off, as people did when speaking to a woman. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "I am looking for the Dugan homestead. I was told to look for the big cottonwoods." "This is the Weston homestead," she said. "But it was the Dugan homestead before that, and those are the cottonwoods you want. What is your business here?" He had a letter in his hand, she saw, a letter that had been through the postal system and then some overland travel and looked the worse for both. He looked at the letter and then at her. "Are you Martha Weston, previously Martha Dugan?" "I am," she said. He held out the letter. "From your mother's sister in Missouri," he said. "My father was asked to carry it west when the post got slow." She had not known precisely that she had a living aunt on her mother's side. The Missouri family had been complicated and scattered, and the connections had attenuated in the years of her own building here. She took the letter and held it and looked at the young man, who was sunburned and tired and clearly had not eaten recently. "You will come in and take a meal and water your horse," she said. It was not an invitation, it was a statement in her way. The young man came in and was fed, and his horse was watered, and he sat at the kitchen table and told them a little of himself, that he was heading further west for work, that he was from outside Springfield, which made Abel's eyebrows go up slightly since he was from outside Springfield too, and they spent a pleasant meal working out whether they had any common acquaintances, discovering too, which felt like too much for a coincidence and too little for a pattern. When he rode on, refreshed and with a wrapped parcel of food for the road, Martha opened the letter from her aunt and read it at the kitchen table while Abel sat across from her, and the children moved in and out of the room with the hummingbird energy of children who were not actively needed elsewhere. The letter was from a woman named Edith, her mother's younger sister, who had found Martha's address through channels the letter did not entirely explain, and who wanted to establish contact after many years. She was a widow herself, Edith, and had a grown daughter, and she wrote with the careful formality of someone reestablishing a connection that had been dropped for reasons no longer relevant. Martha wrote back that same evening, at the kitchen table, with Abel beside her working on the account books for the fall cattle sale, and she wrote honestly and warmly, telling Edith about the homestead and Abel and the children and the life they had built here, and she thought as she wrote that this was what she had built. Not just 60 acres and a cattle operation and a kitchen garden and a beehive, but a life that had enough room in it for an unexpected letter from a Missouri aunt, a life that was open toward the future and its arrivals. She looked up from her letter and found Abel looking at her, not the account books, just looking at her with that expression she had loved for 9 years, the steady, gray-eyed attention that had first made her feel noticed in the way she had always most wanted to be noticed. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just you." She looked at him across the table, this man who had ridden past her fence every morning for a year, adding his half-mile to every day's work, unable to stop and unable to start, until the day he finally did both at once. This man who had fixed her fence and carried her firewood and stood beside her against a land speculator and told her he loved her in the most careful and honest voice she had ever heard. This man who was teaching their son how to tension a fence line with the same patience he had brought to everything in the 12 years she had known him. "Just me," she said. "Just you," he confirmed, with a quietness that made it everything. Outside, the September evening was settling over the Kansas land in long golden bands of light, the cottonwoods at the edge of the property moving slightly in the evening breeze, and the dark bay horse, old now and gray-faced, stood in the paddock with his head over the fence rail in the way he had always had of looking toward the northwest, as though he still remembered all those morning rides, all those half-miles of added distance on roads he could probably have navigated in his sleep. Thomas came in from outside and stood in the kitchen doorway with a small animal in his hands that he had found somewhere in the yard, a baby rabbit, wide-eyed and trembling, and he held it with the careful gentleness of a child who had been taught the value of things that were small and frightened. "Can we keep it?" he asked, with the particular earnest hope of a 7-year-old presenting a proposition to two people whose answer he was not yet sure of. Martha looked at Abel. Abel looked at the rabbit. Then he looked at Martha. "It would need a hutch," he said. "You can build one," she said. "I know I can," he said. "I am just noting the scope of the project." Thomas looked between them with an intensity that a person might normally reserve for events of considerably more significance. And Martha thought that this was love too, this particular ordinary moment in a kitchen in Kansas in 1888. The rabbit and the account books, and the letter from Missouri and the children and the man across the table, and all the years of mornings that had brought them here. "We can keep it," she said to Thomas, and his face produced the kind of joy that only children and very unguarded adults are capable of, immediate and complete and unheld. Abel looked at her with that private almost smile that she had been collecting for a decade. "You are a soft touch, Martha Weston," he said. "I am no such thing," she said. "I am a practical woman who recognizes that a rabbit hutch is a finite and manageable project. With one rabbit that becomes two rabbits," he said, and then Abel. "I am building the hutch," he said. She went back to her letter, and he went back to his account books, and Thomas took the rabbit back outside to show Alice, and the evening settled comfortably around all of them, and the Kansas stars began their patient appearance above the prairie, one by one, in no particular hurry, the way they always came. Martha finished her letter and folded it and addressed it, and she sat for a moment with it in her hands and looked out the kitchen window at the darkening land, her land, their land, the place where she had come with Thomas and stayed after Thomas and found the life she had not known how to imagine when she arrived. She thought about the morning she would send this letter, which would be tomorrow, which would mean a trip to town, which meant the road that he had ridden for a year. She smiled at the window glass and her own reflection in it, the woman she was now, settled and certain and still, after all these years, glad every single morning that he had finally stopped. She put the letter on the table for tomorrow and got up to start the bedtime routine that children required, and Abel closed his account book and came with her, and the house was full of the ordinary sounds of children being brought to rest, and outside the night was coming down soft and dark and full of stars over 60 acres of Kansas land that was wholly and completely and permanently home. The rabbit, as Abel had predicted, eventually became two rabbits, and then rather more than two, and Thomas became the foremost rabbit keeper in the Caldwell School District, which he regarded as a distinction of genuine significance. Alice, by spring, had her own pony fully under her management, and was routinely outrunning her brother on the short race course they had established around the western paddock, a fact that Thomas bore with the philosophical equanimity of a child who had decided to concentrate his competitive energies on the areas where he had actual advantages. In the spring of 1889, the land around them shifted again as Oklahoma Territory opened to settlement, and the great runs began, and tens of thousands of people poured south past Caldwell toward the land that was being opened for homesteading. It was a remarkable thing to watch, the sheer human tide of it, families and single men and adventurers and gamblers all moving south at a pace the land could barely absorb. Abel and Martha watched from their porch as wagon after wagon moved down the southern road, and they talked about what it meant, about the people who were being displaced by those claims even as new people came to claim them, about the injustice of a system that had been making these bargains at others' expense for as long as the frontier had existed. "There is no clean history out here," Abel said one evening, watching the distant movement of yet another wagon train heading south. "No," Martha agreed. "There is not. We built something real here, and it is ours, and it was also land that was not simply empty before we came to it." He looked at her. "How do you hold both of those things?" She thought about it honestly, as she tried to do with everything that mattered. "I hold them both," she said. "I do not pretend one cancels the other. I try to do what is right with what I have, and I try to make sure the children understand the full story, not just the part that makes us comfortable." He nodded slowly. "That is the only honest answer," he said. "I know," she said. "It is not a comfortable one." "No," he said, "but you have never been comfortable when it was a choice between comfortable and true." Looked at him. "No," she said, "I have not." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat with the complicated weight of it, the beauty and the cost of the place they loved, and the commitment to seeing it whole rather than only in the light that flattered it. This, too, she thought, was what it meant to build a real life in a real place. Not just the Sunday rides and the private laugh and the kitchen table mornings, and the way he had always listened to her, as though what she said mattered in the fullest possible sense. But also this, the willingness to sit with the hard things together and not look away. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The stars came out over Kansas, patient as they always were, certain as they always were, and Martha and Abel Weston sat on the south porch of the homestead they had built together and watched the night come down over their land and their life and all the accumulated years of mornings that had made it. And neither of them had anywhere else to be.